You won't believe what happened when I was just washing my car in the driveway. My husband's mother-in-law appeared out of nowhere, glaring at me like I'd done something wrong. She sneered. You'll never get a dime from my inheritance. And in that moment, I realized she had secretly changed the will to leave everything to her cat instead of my family. I felt a mix of shock, anger, and helplessness, but what she didn't know was that I had recorded every cruel word, and finally, justice was within my reach. It all started on a bright spring morning, the kind of day that felt like it was made for beginnings, for promises, and for moments that would later become memories etched into the corners of my heart. I still remember the flutter of excitement in my chest as I stood in front of the full-length mirror, adjusting the delicate lace of my wedding dress, my fingers trembling slightly, not from nerves alone, but from the weight of what was about to change in my life forever. Today, I was not just stepping into a new chapter of my life. I was stepping into a family, a world that came with its own rules, its own subtle tensions, and, as I would soon realize, its own hidden storms. The morning sun spilled through the windows, highlighting the soft gold embroidery along the neckline of my gown, and for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to imagine a world where everything would be perfect. My husband, James, was downstairs, probably nervously adjusting his tie in front of the mirror, muttering half-hearted jokes to calm himself. I had known James for years, our connection rooted in laughter, late-night conversations, and quiet moments where words weren't necessary because our hearts seemed to speak the same language. But marriage was different. Marriage meant merging lives, merging families. And while my heart was full of love, a small part of me was wary. And then, there she was, my mother-in-law, the woman whose influence on James was undeniable, whose sharp tongue and impeccable sense of authority had always intimidated me, though I had never met her up close, until now. She entered the room like a gust of wind, perfectly poised, her outfit immaculate, her dark eyes appraising me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "You look acceptable," she said, her words carefully chosen, balanced between compliment and critique, leaving me uncertain which side I had truly landed on. There was a subtle power in her presence, one that demanded attention without ever raising her voice, and I immediately understood that she was a force to be reckoned with. The ceremony itself was a blur of colors, sounds, and emotions. I remember the way my hand shook slightly as I walked down the aisle, James' gaze locked on mine, full of love and reassurance. Guests whispered, cameras clicked, and somewhere in the distance, the soft strumming of a violin filled the air. But even amidst all the joy, I couldn't shake the awareness of my mother-in-law's eyes following every step I took, as if measuring my worthiness, as if silently questioning whether I was capable of belonging in her family. During the reception, the tension became even more palpable. As I tried to engage in polite conversation with relatives I barely knew, she hovered nearby, offering remarks that were sugar-coated but sharp at the edges. "Oh, how lovely your dress is for a simple wedding," she commented, her smile thin, and I forced a polite laugh, masking the sting that her words delivered. I realized then that my journey as a daughter-in-law would be a delicate dance of diplomacy, patience, and careful observation. Every smile I gave, every word I spoke would be scrutinized. Every misstep could be noticed and remembered, filed away in her mind for reasons I could not yet understand. Yet, there were moments of pure, unadulterated happiness. James pulled me aside to a quiet corner of the garden, his hands warm around mine. "You're incredible," he whispered, his eyes soft and full of love. "No one else matters today, just you and me." And for those few stolen moments, it felt like the world had shrunk to just us, like the worries, the expectations, and the silent judgments had faded into nothing. I allowed myself to breathe, to laugh, to dance with the man I loved, and to believe, just for a little while, that maybe we could navigate this complex web of family dynamics together. Dinner came, a lavish affair with more courses than I could count, each plated delicately, as if the chefs knew the event required perfection. My mother-in-law presided over the table with the poise of a queen, her opinions flowing freely, often under the guise of concern or advice. "Make sure she knows how to manage her new responsibilities," she said softly to James, a statement that sounded benign but carried a weight I couldn't ignore. It was a subtle reminder of the hierarchy, a quiet assertion of control, and I felt my stomach twist. I was marrying James, yes, but I was also stepping into a world where I would constantly have to defend my place, my choices, and my worth. As the night drew on, speeches were made, champagne flowed, and laughter echoed through the halls. Friends and family shared stories, some heartwarming, some humorous, and some that brought tears to our eyes. But throughout it all, the presence of my mother-in-law was a constant undercurrent, a subtle but undeniable reminder that joy, in her eyes, always came with conditions. And though the day was filled with love and celebration, I couldn't ignore the small, piercing seed of doubt that had been planted. Walking into the suite that evening, hand in hand with James, the city lights sparkling below us, I finally allowed myself to reflect on the day. I was happy, truly, deeply happy, but I also knew that the road ahead would be complicated. Love was strong, yes, but family dynamics, expectations, and unspoken rules could challenge even the strongest bonds. I looked into James' eyes, and he held mine with the silent promise that we would face whatever came next together. And in that moment, I made a quiet vow to myself, to love, to endure, and to rise above whatever challenges the mother-in-law or anyone else might throw in our path. The beginning of our marriage was not just about a wedding day. It was about stepping into a life where joy and conflict would coexist, where love and tension would dance in delicate balance, and where my resilience as a daughter-in-law would soon be tested in ways I could never have imagined. And while I could not have foreseen the battles ahead, the subtle cruelties, the whispered criticisms, or the ultimate showdown that would come years later, this first day planted the seeds of strength, awareness, and determination that would carry me forward. It was a beginning full of hope, love, and unspoken challenges, a chapter that would set the stage for everything that followed. Life after the wedding initially felt like a delicate dream. James and I were navigating our new life together, learning the rhythms of shared responsibilities, and embracing the joy of waking up each morning knowing we had each other. But soon, subtle cracks began to appear in the otherwise perfect surface of our newlywed bliss. These were not dramatic confrontations or outright arguments. They were quiet, almost imperceptible signals that hinted at the true nature of my mother-in-law, the woman whose presence had always loomed large even before I officially became part of the family. The first sign came on a seemingly ordinary Sunday morning. I had spent the previous evening cleaning our small but cozy home, ensuring everything was in order, hoping to impress James and, perhaps subconsciously myself. I was in the kitchen making breakfast when the phone rang. On the other end was my mother-in-law, her tone deceptively cheerful, as though she were speaking to a friend rather than her son's wife. "Oh, darling," she began, "I just hope you're keeping the house tidy. You know how James likes things precise." Her words sounded benign at first, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of judgment, a subtle implication that I might not be capable of living up to her expectations. At first, I brushed it off. I told myself she was just concerned, that perhaps her advice came from a place of love. But the comments kept coming, each carefully crafted to undermine my confidence while maintaining the facade of politeness. One afternoon, while James was at work, she arrived unexpectedly, ostensibly to check on the house. As she walked through, she scrutinized every corner, every object, every small detail. "Oh, you didn't put the silverware in the right drawer," she remarked casually, almost as if she were offering a helpful tip, yet the sting was sharp. I felt a flicker of irritation, quickly masked by a polite smile, but deep inside, I sensed that this was not kindness. It was control disguised as concern. Another early warning came during a family gathering at our home. My mother-in-law had invited a few extended relatives, and as we sat around the table, she made small remarks that seemed innocent but carried hidden barbs. "You must be careful with the groceries. James has certain standards," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I noticed a few relatives exchange knowing glances, and my stomach sank. It was clear she was establishing a hierarchy, reminding everyone subtly who was in charge, who held influence, and who was still trying to find their footing. I realized then that my role as daughter-in-law would not be a simple one. Every action, every choice would be observed, judged, and perhaps even manipulated for her own purposes. The tension escalated further during a casual conversation about finances. While sipping tea in the sunlit living room, she casually mentioned the family estate, her words dripping with insinuation. "I just hope you understand, my dear, that family inheritance isn't something to be taken lightly. Some people think they have a claim when they really don't," she said, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly as she looked at me. The implications were subtle but unmistakable. She was planting seeds of doubt, implying that I was somehow unworthy, unfit, or naive when it came to matters that were clearly important to her. A shiver ran down my spine. I knew this was the beginning of a deeper, more personal battle that would test my resilience and patience in ways I had never imagined. Even our interactions with James began to shift subtly. I could see the tension in his eyes when she visited, the careful way he tried to mediate between us. "Don't take it personally," he would whisper, after she left. "She means well in her own way." But I knew better. There was a precision to her cruelty, a meticulousness in her words that went beyond simple concern or misunderstanding. She was laying the groundwork for control, establishing boundaries that were hers to define, and she expected me to conform without question. It was not only her words, but her actions that unsettled me. She would rearrange items in our home without asking, comment on the way I cooked meals, and even subtly criticize my choice of friends or the way I spent my free time. The more I observed, the more patterns I recognized. Every compliment was calculated, every gesture measured, and every suggestion had a hidden double meaning. I began keeping mental notes, cataloging incidents, analyzing the timing and context of each remark, trying to understand her strategy without revealing my growing awareness. The first true confrontation occurred over something so mundane that it might have seemed insignificant to an outsider, a family dinner that I had carefully planned to welcome her. I had prepared James' favorite dishes, decorated the table with fresh flowers, and even baked a small cake for dessert. Yet, as she arrived, she found faults immediately. "I see you've tried, but James likes his roast a bit more done, don't you think?" she said, her words sharp yet coated in sugar. I felt my cheeks flush with a mix of embarrassment and anger, and for a brief moment, I wanted to snap. But instead, I smiled, offered polite corrections, and quietly resolved that this would not define my relationship with her or with James. These early signs were like small, precise arrows piercing the calm surface of our married life. Each moment, each comment, each subtle critique was a test of my patience and judgment. They made me question myself, my abilities, and even my place in the family. Yet, amidst this growing tension, a quiet determination began to take root. I realized that understanding her patterns and motives was the first step toward protecting myself and my marriage. I needed to be vigilant, to observe, and to prepare for the day when her cruelty would reveal its full weight. What made it even more challenging was her ability to maintain appearances. To outsiders, she was the perfect mother-in-law, charming, articulate, and seemingly benevolent. No one could see the calculated cruelty, the manipulations, or the subtle power plays that she wove into daily life. I felt isolated at times, like I was navigating a minefield with invisible traps, and yet, I knew I couldn't show fear or weakness, not to James, not to her, and certainly not to myself. By the end of those early months, I had learned one important truth. Marriage was not just about love between two people. It was about navigating families, alliances, expectations, and sometimes hidden agendas. I understood that my mother-in-law's influence was formidable, and if I wanted to protect my marriage, my home, and my own peace of mind, I would have to confront her in my own way, strategically, carefully, and decisively. The first signs were just that. Signs. Small, seemingly innocuous, but filled with intent, and I knew deep down that they foreshadowed the complex and dramatic journey that lay ahead. And so, life continued, with subtle battles, careful observations, and the quiet accumulation of knowledge that would later become my weapon in a confrontation that no one saw coming. The first signs were warnings, whispers of a storm that would test our marriage, our patience, and ultimately, the very fabric of our family. Life in the first months after the wedding settled into a rhythm that was both comforting and surprisingly complex. On the surface, it looked like the picture of domestic bliss, James and I sharing quiet mornings together, sipping coffee on the balcony as the city slowly woke, exchanging small smiles and whispered words that carried our love. But beneath this peaceful facade, the presence of my mother-in-law loomed like an unseen shadow, a force that subtly influenced almost every corner of our daily existence. Even the smallest acts of routine became arenas for tension, silent tests of my patience, my judgment, and my ability to maintain my composure while being scrutinized by the woman whose approval seemed impossible to earn. Breakfast was always the first trial of the day when she visited. James and I would sit down, ready to enjoy a simple meal, scrambled eggs, toast, and freshly brewed coffee. But if she was there, nothing ever stayed simple. "You know, a proper omelet should be folded like this," she would say, demonstrating with exaggerated motions, her tone polite yet biting, leaving me feeling simultaneously observed and diminished. Even the smallest imperfection, a slightly uneven slice of bread, a bit too much butter, a minor smudge on the plate, was transformed into evidence of incompetence in her mind. It was never outright confrontation at first, just a subtle, insidious erosion of confidence, and over time, I began noticing how meticulously she catalogued every detail, every flaw, and every deviation from her standard of perfection. Grocery shopping became another battlefield. What started as innocent suggestions, "Oh, I think James prefers this brand of cereal," soon turned into unsolicited critiques of my choices, the way I budgeted, the brands I selected, the meals I planned for the week. I remember one afternoon, pushing a cart through the bright aisles of a supermarket when she suddenly appeared beside me as if by magic. "Do you really think organic milk is worth it? James doesn't care for it," she remarked, her words light, but their weight heavy and deliberate. My cheeks flushed, half from embarrassment, half from the realization that even outside the house, she seemed determined to impose her authority, to remind me that I was still an outsider trying to navigate her world. Even simple errands, like paying bills or picking up dry cleaning, became moments where her subtle criticisms lingered in my mind long after she had gone. Her ability to turn the ordinary into the extraordinary, to make every task a test of my character and competence, was exhausting. Some days, I felt as though I was walking a tightrope suspended over a pit of judgment, one wrong move threatening to topple not just my own sense of self-worth, but the fragile harmony of our marriage. At home, the tension continued in small, almost imperceptible ways. Furniture would be rearranged according to her taste when she visited, decorations would be subtly criticized, and even the arrangement of photographs on the wall was deemed inappropriate. "James has always preferred a more minimalist approach," she said casually one afternoon as she moved a picture frame slightly to the left, her hands delicate but assertive. I smiled politely, yet inwardly I felt a surge of frustration. It was clear that in her mind, my role was not to live comfortably in my own home but to adhere to her invisible rules, to live under her constant evaluation. Despite these challenges, there were moments of beauty and quiet joy. I discovered that mornings with James could still be peaceful when she wasn't around. We shared coffee on the balcony, listened to the soft hum of the city waking up, and laughed about small things, funny stories from work, old memories, inside jokes that no one else understood. These moments reminded me why I had married him, why love could persist even in a landscape shadowed by judgment and cruelty. I learned to treasure these pockets of intimacy, these fragile islands of calm, as a kind of emotional survival. Work life added another layer of complexity. As a professional, I had responsibilities outside the home, deadlines to meet, and colleagues who depended on me. But even in this sphere, the echoes of my mother-in-law's judgments followed me. I would recount small anecdotes of her critiques to James in an attempt to gain perspective, and sometimes the tension from home would spill over into my workday, leaving me restless and distracted. Balancing the demands of my career, my marriage, and the constant scrutiny from my mother-in-law was like juggling flaming torches while walking on a narrow ledge, a test that required patience, strategy, and an almost preternatural calm under pressure. Family gatherings were, without a doubt, the most emotionally taxing part of daily life. Holidays, birthdays, and casual visits were often tinged with the subtle manipulations and power plays she was so adept at. She had a way of making others laugh, of charming friends and relatives, while simultaneously planting seeds of doubt in my mind. "I hope you're not too tired from work. James will need you to be fully rested for our little family dinner," she would say, a casual remark layered with expectation and control. I learned to navigate these moments carefully, smiling and nodding while keeping a mental ledger of her words and actions, each one a clue to understanding her methods. Yet, despite the difficulties, I grew stronger. Each day, each challenge, each subtle test of patience became a lesson in resilience. I learned to listen carefully, to observe, and to anticipate her moves. I documented every word, every gesture, and every subtle attempt to undermine me, not out of obsession, but out of a growing sense of necessity. I understood that knowledge was power, and if I wanted to protect myself, my marriage, and my family, I needed to be both perceptive and strategic. By the end of these early months, I had developed a kind of rhythm, a system for managing her presence without losing myself in the process. I learned to cherish the moments of quiet with James, to find joy in our small victories, and to prepare silently for the confrontations that would inevitably come. Daily life was no longer just about chores, errands, and routine. It had become a careful dance of observation, strategy, and emotional endurance. The subtle cruelty of my mother-in-law was constant, but so too was my determination. Each day of domestic life, each breakfast, each errand, each conversation became a small battlefield where I learned the limits of my patience, the strength of my resilience, and the value of careful planning. And even though life at home was often tense, even though I sometimes felt weary from the constant evaluation, I knew that every detail I recorded, every pattern I noticed was laying the foundation for a day when justice, cleverness, and courage would finally intersect, and when the subtle cruelty of my mother-in-law would meet its reckoning. Life in the early days of marriage was not simply about love, it was about navigating the intricate, invisible rules of a family system where one person's words could wield immense power. The daily grind, once mundane and comforting, had become a training ground, teaching me patience, vigilance, and the quiet art of strategy. And as I moved through each day, performing small acts of domestic life under her watchful eyes, I began to understand that the ordinary could hide extraordinary lessons, that patience could become a weapon, and that the ordinary cadence of daily life could one day lead to the extraordinary climax I had yet to imagine. Life had been a careful balancing act for months. I had learned to navigate the subtle cruelties of my mother-in-law, to maintain patience, to smile politely, and to document every sharp remark and veiled criticism. Each day was a test of my endurance and strategy, but I felt prepared, confident that my cautious approach would help me weather whatever storm she might conjure. Little did I know that one ordinary afternoon would shatter my sense of security and reveal a secret so shocking it would change everything I thought I knew about my family, my husband, and the seemingly untouchable authority of my mother-in-law. It started like any other day. I was tidying up the living room, placing cushions neatly on the sofa, arranging the books on the shelf, and humming a tune that James always found comforting. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm, golden glow across the room, and for a fleeting moment, the ordinary serenity of domestic life felt almost real. James had gone to work, and the house was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock and the hum of the refrigerator. I had just picked up a stack of mail when I noticed an envelope that didn't belong to me. It was thick, heavy, and had my mother-in-law's elegant, precise handwriting on the front. Curiosity nudged me forward, but there was a flicker of unease as well, a premonition that this ordinary piece of paper might conceal something far from ordinary. I carefully slit the envelope open with a letter opener, my hands trembling slightly. Inside were several documents, legal papers, a copy of a will, and a series of handwritten notes that made my heart pound in my chest. As I unfolded the first page, my eyes widened in disbelief. There it was, my mother-in-law's signature, the official legal seal, and the words that would forever change my understanding of her character. She had secretly altered the family will, diverting the inheritance away from me and my husband, and shockingly, leaving the majority to her cat's trust. Yes, her cat, a perfectly pampered feline named Whiskers, who had a velvet bed and gourmet meals, yet now had become the primary beneficiary of her carefully accumulated estate. I dropped the papers onto the coffee table, feeling as if the air had suddenly been sucked from the room. My mind raced. How could someone be so calculating, so cruel, and so utterly deliberate in their actions? Every subtle jab, every criticism I had endured, every moment of tension I had tried to endure patiently now took on a new meaning. It wasn't just personality quirks or overprotectiveness, it was strategy. A hidden agenda. A silent assertion of power and control designed to humiliate and manipulate. I realized that I had underestimated the lengths my mother-in-law would go to assert her dominance and secure her perceived supremacy, even from beyond the grave. For hours, I sat there, scanning the documents, rereading the notes she had left, each line more infuriating than the last. There were explicit instructions regarding the estate, detailed lists of who would receive what, and meticulously written justifications for her decisions. It was as though she had anticipated every possible objection, every emotional appeal, and had built a fortress of words and legality to protect herself and her whims. My hands shook as I absorbed the enormity of her betrayal. James and I had worked hard, had dreamed of building a life together, and here was a cruel obstacle, carefully planted, that threatened to undo everything we had built. As the shock began to settle into a simmering fury, I remember the small recorder I had secretly kept, capturing her cruel words during visits, conversations, and phone calls. I had not shared this with James yet, but now, with the confirmation of her intentions in black and white, I understood the value of those recordings. They were no longer merely tools for self-defense or documentation. They were ammunition, a silent weapon against injustice, and a key to reclaiming dignity and security. I thought back to all the subtle moments that had seemed insignificant, the dismissive comments over breakfast, the critiques of my cooking, the veiled threats about James' preferences, and even the sly insinuations about finances. Each had been a clue, a piece of a larger puzzle I hadn't realized I was assembling. Now, everything aligned, and the picture it formed was clear. My mother-in-law was not only manipulative but strategically cruel, deliberately undermining my place in the family and attempting to rewrite the future in her favor. Fear and anger battled within me. Fear, because this revelation could strain my marriage, alienate family members, and threaten the financial stability that James and I had been carefully cultivating. Anger, because the betrayal was personal, targeted, and calculated. It was a betrayal of trust, love, and the basic decency one expects from family. I felt a wave of indignation rise, but alongside it was something else, determination. I realized that knowledge was power, and now I had the full scope of a situation. I had the documents, I had the recordings, and I had the moral high ground. It was time to strategize, to prepare, and to consider how to confront this carefully constructed cruelty. I also reflected on James' perspective. How would he react when he learned the truth? I knew he loved his mother, but I also knew he loved me. Balancing the revelation of her actions with his loyalty and emotional attachments required finesse. This was not just a legal or financial battle, it was an emotional minefield, where every word, every gesture, and every confrontation had to be meticulously considered. I spent that evening organizing my thoughts, reviewing the documents, and planning a careful approach that would allow justice to prevail without unnecessary devastation to the family dynamic. And then, as I sat there alone in the quiet living room, I made a decision. I would not let her cruelty dictate the course of our lives. I would not allow a cat to inherit what was rightfully ours, and I would not allow manipulation, intimidation, and silent cruelty to dictate the terms of our family's future. I realized, with a clarity that was both frightening and empowering, that the days of being patient and passive were over. The secret was revealed, the veil lifted, and the path forward became clear. I would confront this challenge with strategy, courage, and the quiet resolve of someone who had been underestimated, dismissed, and yet had gained all the tools necessary to reclaim control. But as I prepared mentally for the confrontation, another thought struck me, sharp and unrelenting. What other secrets had she kept? What other plans, what hidden manipulations, lay buried in her meticulous mind, waiting for the right moment to surface? This revelation, as shocking as it was, felt like just the beginning, a precursor to a deeper, more dramatic struggle that would test my ingenuity, my patience, and my very sense of self. I understood, in that moment, that the battle was not just for inheritance or legal documents. It was for respect, dignity, and the right to live free from calculated cruelty. The secret was out, but the story was far from over. The revelation had opened a door that could not be closed, and the world I had thought I knew had shifted irreversibly. And yet, for the first time, I felt a spark of power, a seed of hope, and a clear sense of direction. I knew that, with careful planning and unwavering resolve, I could turn this betrayal into an opportunity for justice, for vindication, and ultimately, for reclaiming the life that my husband and I had dreamed of from the very beginning. The quiet of the afternoon lingered, the sunlight dimming as clouds gathered outside, mirroring the storm of thoughts in my mind. But amid the tension, I felt an unshakable certainty. The truth had been revealed, and now, armed with knowledge and strategy, I was ready to face the ultimate challenge, to confront my mother-in-law, to expose her cruelty, and to take control of the narrative that had been carefully manipulated for far too long. The secret had been revealed, but the story, the real story, was only just beginning. After the shocking discovery of my mother-in-law's secret manipulation of the will, the dynamics in my marriage began to shift in ways I had never anticipated. At first, James remained blissfully unaware of the full extent of her cruelty. He knew she had strong opinions, of course, and he had always admired her intelligence and ability to control situations, but he had no idea that the very foundation of our family's future had been undermined right under our noses. Every conversation we had in those days was tinged with unspoken tension, a delicate dance where I had to carefully decide how much to reveal, how much to protect, and how to navigate his feelings without pushing him into conflict with his mother. It all came to a head one evening when I returned from work, exhausted after a long day, only to find James pacing the living room. His face was tight with frustration, eyes darting to the door each time it opened as though expecting an argument to erupt at any moment. "We need to talk," he said abruptly, his voice uncharacteristically sharp. My stomach twisted with unease. I knew this moment would come sooner or later. I had prepared for confrontation with my mother-in-law, but now I faced the emotional minefield that was my husband's uncertainty and loyalty. We sat down at the dining table, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the room. I could see the strain etched into James' face, worry, confusion, and a subtle defensiveness that I knew was rooted not in me, but in his fear of disappointing his mother. I took a deep breath, knowing that how I approached this conversation would define the balance of our marriage in the weeks and months to come. "James," I began gently, trying to steady my voice, "there's something I need to show you, something serious about your mother and the family estate." His brow furrowed, and he leaned forward, eyes wide with curiosity and a hint of dread. "What is it?" he asked, though I could see the tension building in his jaw. I handed him the documents I had discovered, the altered will, the notes, and the instructions she had left. As he flipped through the papers, his face went pale, and his fingers trembled slightly. The air between us thickened with shock, disbelief, and the realization that the woman he had loved and respected for decades had acted in secret to undermine our lives. I can't believe this," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Mom, she would never. Why would she do this?" His voice cracked slightly, the first sign of vulnerability I had seen in him since we had started discussing her manipulations. I reached across the table and took his hand, trying to offer reassurance while also maintaining my own sense of composure. "She did it, James," I said softly but firmly. "And now we know. We can't change the past, but we can decide how to move forward." The next few hours were a whirlwind of emotions. James alternated between anger, disbelief, and guilt. He blamed himself for not noticing the subtle manipulations sooner, for allowing her influence over our marriage to remain unchecked. "I should have seen this," he said repeatedly, his voice heavy with self-reproach. I held him close, explaining gently that the responsibility was not his alone, that her cruelty was carefully calculated, and that even the most observant person could have been caught off guard. It was a delicate balance, acknowledging the emotional weight he carried while also reinforcing the importance of facing the situation strategically rather than emotionally. For the next few days, tension simmered between us. Even simple interactions, like deciding on dinner plans or discussing weekend activities, carried an undercurrent of strain. Every phone call from his mother became a potential flashpoint. Every word she spoke a minefield of hidden meaning and possible conflict. I noticed James flinch at times, unconsciously adjusting his tone or choice of words to avoid triggering confrontation, and it pained me to see the subtle erosion of his confidence and peace of mind. It was a cruel paradox. The person we both loved most was also the source of the greatest tension in our lives. Despite the strain, these moments also became opportunities for us to strengthen our bond. We had long conversations about boundaries, about loyalty, and about how to navigate the complex web of family relationships without losing ourselves. I learned to communicate more clearly, to express my concerns without accusation, and to listen deeply to James' fears and perspectives. He, in turn, began to understand my growing awareness of his mother's manipulations and the careful strategies I was developing to protect our family. We were learning, in real time, how to be a united front in the face of a subtle but relentless adversary. The tension reached its peak one evening when his mother unexpectedly arrived at our home without warning, as she often did, her presence immediately filling the space with a palpable sense of authority and judgment. James and I had just sat down for dinner, and the abrupt knock on the door sent a ripple of anxiety through both of us. I took a deep breath, prepared to remain calm, while James hesitated, torn between greeting his mother with courtesy and protecting the fragile peace we had established in our home. When the door opened, her eyes met mine, a mixture of surprise and concealed triumph glinting in her gaze. She didn't acknowledge the tension. Instead, she smiled, as if she were unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Dinner that night became a carefully choreographed performance. I served the meal while observing every word, every gesture, every subtle attempt at control. James oscillated between defending my choices and maintaining his customary respect for his mother, and I could feel the strain building with each passing minute. It was exhausting, emotionally and mentally, but I also recognized that these moments were training grounds, opportunities to test our resilience, our communication, and our ability to remain united despite the manipulations designed to fracture our marriage. We ended the evening with quiet reflection. Once she left, James turned to me, his eyes shadowed with emotion. "I don't want to fight with her," he said, his voice low, "but I also don't want to lose you in the process." I nodded, understanding the delicate balance of loyalty and love that weighed on him. "We won't fight unnecessarily," I assured him, "but we also won't allow her to control us. Together, we're stronger than she knows." And in that moment, a subtle shift occurred. The tension was still there, thick and undeniable, but it was now tempered by a sense of partnership, a shared understanding that we would face her together, strategically and resolutely. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a transformation in our dynamic. The tension remained, but it became more focused, less chaotic. We began to anticipate her moves, to communicate silently through glances and gestures, and to develop a strategy for managing her influence without sacrificing our marriage or our emotional well-being. Each conversation, each interaction, became a deliberate test, a chance to observe, learn, and prepare for the ultimate confrontation that would one day expose her cruelty and reclaim our peace. The tension with my husband was not a sign of weakness. It was a reflection of the extraordinary pressures imposed by a manipulative mother-in-law. It was a crucible that tested our patience, communication, and love. And though the days were exhausting, filled with frustration, whispered debates, and subtle negotiations, I knew that enduring this tension together was forging a bond stronger than any challenge she could throw at us. The secret had been revealed, the threat identified, and now, in the quiet spaces between conflict and compromise, James and I were building the foundation for the decisive moment when justice, strategy, and courage would finally intersect. After months of enduring my mother-in-law's subtle cruelties and navigating the tense dynamics with James, I realized that patience and observation alone were no longer enough. I had gathered evidence of her manipulations, meticulously documented her words and actions, and prepared mentally for a confrontation, but the first step toward reclaiming control had to be subtle, strategic, and above all undeniable. This was not about open conflict yet. It was about planting seeds, demonstrating capability, and showing, in quiet but undeniable ways, that her attempts to dominate and belittle me would no longer succeed. The opportunity came unexpectedly one Saturday morning. James had gone to run errands, leaving me at home to finish some chores and enjoy a rare moment of solitude. I noticed that the mail had piled up, including a few letters addressed to her, full of requests and plans that, if left unaddressed, could create embarrassment or logistical problems for her. I carefully studied each letter, cross-referenced them with schedules, and devised a plan. I would preemptively address the minor issues she had overlooked, fixing small mistakes and arranging details she had either ignored or assumed would create tension. When she arrived later that afternoon, the air was heavy with expectation. She stepped through the door, her posture commanding, her gaze sharp, yet she seemed unaware that I had been quietly orchestrating a small but significant reversal of control. "Darling," she said in her usual clipped tone, "I hope everything is in order." "I hate surprises." I smiled, hiding the surge of satisfaction bubbling inside me. "Everything is handled," I replied, calm and measured, as though I were simply performing my daily duties. But she didn't yet realize that the perfection before her eyes was no ordinary tidying. It was a deliberate demonstration that I was fully capable of managing the household in ways she had never anticipated. The first act of subtle revenge began in the kitchen. I had noticed that she always complained about the placement of cutlery and the organization of the pantry. On her previous visits, she would rearrange cabinets, insisting that James had preferences she was honoring. That day, I anticipated her moves. I had reorganized the kitchen according to her unspoken standards, yet also added small, clever adjustments, placing items where she would notice, but in a way that subtly undermined her sense of control. When she opened the pantry and observed the order, her eyebrows lifted slightly, a flicker of surprise in her expression. I offered a polite, serene smile, as though nothing had occurred, while inwardly I relished the silent victory. Next came a minor logistical challenge that I had identified from her correspondence, an upcoming gathering she had planned for extended family. The invitations had been sent incorrectly, with dates and times mismatched, a detail she would likely have blamed others for, creating unnecessary chaos. I quietly corrected every detail, emailed the corrected invitations, and even called a few relatives to clarify the schedule. When she later mentioned her plan, I responded with calm authority. "Actually, I noticed a few discrepancies and thought it would be helpful to correct them before anyone was confused." She paused, her eyes narrowing just slightly, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind. Was this the daughter-in-law she had dismissed so casually, now quietly outperforming her? The most satisfying part of my first subtle revenge, however, came in the living room. I had noticed her habit of leaving James' favorite chair slightly uncomfortable, adjusting pillows in a way that subtly reminded everyone who controlled the space. That day, I preemptively arranged the chair perfectly, fluffed the pillows, and even left a small token, a fresh cup of tea and a neatly folded blanket, on the side table. When she entered, her gaze swept the room, pausing on the chair. Her lips tightened, a faint exhale betraying surprise and perhaps irritation. "I see someone has been attentive," she remarked, her voice clipped but laced with a subtle edge. I smiled softly, "Just making sure everything is comfortable for you, as you always prefer." On the surface, politeness. Beneath it, a quiet assertion that I was no longer a passive participant in her carefully controlled environment. Even small social interactions became stages for subtle victories. During a casual conversation over tea, she began to critique the arrangement of books on the shelf, a favorite pastime of hers to demonstrate her authority. I allowed her to begin, listening carefully, then offered gentle suggestions, rearranging a few items in ways that improved both aesthetics and functionality. "That's actually quite clever," she remarked unexpectedly, a flicker of grudging respect, or perhaps disbelief, crossing her face. I merely nodded, letting her think she had influenced the arrangement, while in reality, every move had been under my careful control. The satisfaction was intoxicating. Each subtle act built momentum, demonstrating that I could outmaneuver her without confrontation, relying instead on intelligence, observation, and precise action. These subtle acts of revenge extended beyond the home. I began to gently influence James' perception of his mother's behavior, sharing small anecdotes or observations that highlighted her manipulations without direct accusation. "Did you notice how she?" I would ask casually, allowing him to observe patterns for himself. Over time, James began to see the shifts, to recognize the precision of her cruelty, and to understand that our challenges were not merely misunderstandings but deliberate acts of control. It was a delicate balance, showing him truth without inflaming conflict, but it slowly laid the groundwork for a united front that would be essential in the confrontations to come. The thrill of my first subtle revenge was not in drama or confrontation, but in the quiet satisfaction of reclaiming agency. Each action, each minor victory, demonstrated that the power dynamics were shifting. My mother-in-law, who had believed her word was law and her whims absolute, was encountering resistance she had not anticipated. The subtlety was key. It kept the tension low enough that she could not retaliate openly, yet visible enough that she could sense the change, a creeping awareness that she was no longer the undisputed authority. By the end of that week, I had laid a foundation of small victories that would compound over time. Every corrected error, every improved arrangement, every quietly anticipated need built momentum, creating a psychological advantage that I would leverage in future confrontations. The first subtle revenge was more than a tactical maneuver. It was an assertion of self-worth, a reclaiming of dignity, and a demonstration that clever strategy could outmaneuver years of manipulation. Even in moments of calm, I could feel the tension beneath the surface, the unspoken awareness that she was sensing my growing confidence and capability. This was just the beginning. The quiet, meticulous preparation, the observation of patterns, and the carefully executed subtle revenge had set the stage for the larger, decisive confrontations that would come. And though she remained outwardly composed, I could sense the unease, a quiet recognition that her control was slipping, and that the daughter-in-law she had underestimated was quietly, patiently, and brilliantly preparing to reclaim what had been denied. The first subtle revenge had been executed flawlessly, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with intelligence, patience, and precision. And as I watched her leave that evening, unaware of the full extent of my planning, I realized with a thrill of satisfaction that the balance of power had begun to shift. My mother-in-law's reign of quiet control was being challenged, and the next steps in this delicate and dramatic game promised to be even more satisfying. It was a quiet Monday morning when the news arrived like a thunderclap, shattering the fragile balance we had been maintaining in our household. James' phone buzzed insistently on the kitchen counter, and when he glanced at the screen, his face turned pale, and the color seemed to drain from the room. It's Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling in a way I had never heard before. She passed away last night." For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, the usual sounds of the city fading into a surreal silence. I stood frozen, trying to reconcile the intensity of emotions coursing through me: shock, grief, anger, and an almost surreal sense of opportunity that I barely allowed myself to acknowledge. The days leading up to the funeral were a blur of preparations, calls, and arrangements, each more emotionally taxing than the last. Family members from distant cities began arriving, their expressions a mix of mourning and curiosity, while whispers circulated about the suddenness of her passing. James struggled to process his grief, oscillating between tears, silent contemplation, and moments of numbness that left me both empathetic and painfully aware of my own complex feelings toward his mother. My mind, however, was sharply focused. I knew that amidst the sorrow, there were crucial opportunities for truth, for justice, and for revealing the careful cruelty she had wielded throughout our lives. The funeral itself was held on a crisp, overcast afternoon. The sky was gray, mirroring the heaviness in the hearts of everyone present. As we arrived, I noticed the meticulous attention she had always demanded of appearances. The flowers, the arrangement of chairs, the program of readings, all carefully curated even in death. The family's whispers filled the chapel, a mixture of sorrow, speculation, and subtle judgment. I felt a complex mix of emotions, grief mingled with indignation, a sense of loss mingled with the burning need for justice that had been simmering silently for months. During the service, the minister spoke eloquently about her life, her generosity, and her devotion to family, but I could not shake the bitter irony of his words. Generosity, devotion, the truth I knew was far more complex. A woman who had wielded her words like weapons, manipulated relationships for control, and altered her will in ways that undermined those she claimed to love. As the eulogies continued, I felt the tension within me building, a careful restraint forming as I prepared for the moments that would follow. The funeral, I realized, was not just a mourning ritual, it was the stage for the ultimate revelation. After the ceremony, family members gathered in the receiving area, their expressions polite but fraught with curiosity. Conversations were low and measured, often circling the same familiar topics: memories of childhood, achievements, and the legacy left behind. I noticed subtle glances in my direction, some curious, others skeptical, and a few tinged with quiet admiration for the composure I maintained. James remained close to me, his hand occasionally brushing mine, a silent acknowledgement of our shared understanding, our growing partnership, and the strategy we were about to enact. The reading of the will was scheduled for the late afternoon in the lawyer's office, a small room lined with leather chairs and shelves of legal tomes. As we sat, I could feel the air thick with anticipation, tension, and an unspoken awareness that this moment would determine the family's understanding of her legacy. James' mother-in-law, of course, was absent in life, but her influence hung heavily in the room, palpable in the careful arrangements, the papers, and the collected relatives. When the lawyer began to speak, the words seemed almost surreal. According to the last will and testament, the distribution of assets will be... I held my breath, knowing that the meticulous evidence I had gathered would soon transform these ordinary words into a revelation of her deliberate cruelty. As the lawyer read the specifics, I could see James' eyes widen with both shock and anger. She had indeed made provisions that were both baffling and infuriating: the cat's trust, unusual stipulations, and subtle omissions that left him and me at the mercy of her whims. But I remained calm, suppressing the surge of triumph I felt internally. This was the moment I had prepared for, not with confrontation, but with undeniable evidence, ready to reveal the manipulations she had so carefully hidden. My recordings and documents, kept secret for months, were now poised to transform grief into clarity, chaos into understanding, and subtle manipulation into undeniable truth. The reactions of the extended family were revealing. Some murmured in disbelief, others exchanged shocked glances, and a few even whispered apologies for their past judgments. The realization that the seemingly whimsical and harmless actions of my mother-in-law had been strategic, cruel, and manipulative was sinking in, and the air was thick with tension and the unspoken acknowledgement of a family secret finally brought to light. Each revelation was like a quiet shock wave reverberating through the room, leaving everyone momentarily stunned and reflective. During a quiet moment, I glanced at James. The grief in his eyes had not vanished, but there was a flicker of understanding, a spark of recognition that he now fully comprehended the depth of her manipulations and the injustice that had been quietly inflicted upon us. My heart ached for him, for the complexity of his emotions, but I also felt a surge of determination. The funeral, with all its solemnity and sorrow, had provided the perfect stage for the first real opportunity to assert truth and prepare for the ultimate reckoning. As we left the lawyer's office and stepped into the overcast afternoon, the tension between sorrow and justice weighed heavily on us. The city's streets, bustling with indifferent energy, contrasted sharply with the storm of revelations and emotions that churned within our family. I knew that the true work was only beginning. The subtle revenge I had practiced, the careful documentation, and the shared understanding with James were all preparations for the next phase, confronting the legacy of cruelty and asserting control over a situation that had long been manipulated by my mother-in-law. That day, I realized the power of patience, observation, and meticulous planning. The funeral was not just an ending, it was a beginning, a pivot point in a story of family, manipulation, and the quest for justice. Every subtle glance, every reaction from relatives, and every whispered acknowledgement of the will's oddities were building blocks for the final resolution. My mother-in-law's presence, though absent in life, had orchestrated one last test, and I was now ready to meet it with strategy, courage, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the truth could no longer be hidden. And yet, as we drove home, the clouds thickened above, mirroring the uncertainty and tension that still lingered. Questions remained unanswered. Had her manipulations extended even further? Would other hidden plans surface in the days to come? The funeral had been unexpected, the revelations staggering, and the emotions overwhelming, but I understood clearly that this was not the conclusion. It was the moment before the next chapter, a critical juncture where strategy, courage, and patience would collide in ways that promised both justice and a reckoning long overdue. The unexpected funeral had revealed truths that had been buried, And though sorrow hung in the air, a sense of clarity and purpose now guided every decision. I knew that the coming days would demand not just resilience, but cleverness, planning, and an unwavering commitment to exposing the cruelty that had long been masked by appearances and polite smiles. The stage was set, the players aware, and the story, dramatic, tense, and emotionally charged, was poised to reach its next, inevitable climax. In the weeks following my mother-in-law's sudden passing and the revelations of her will, a new tension emerged, one that struck at the very foundation of our family's stability: financial manipulation. At first, the irregularities seemed minor: unexpected fees, unexplained charges, and small bureaucratic obstacles that required attention. But as I delved deeper, the pattern became undeniable. She had created a complex web of accounts, trusts, and obscure clauses designed to keep us off balance, dependent and uncertain. Every document I uncovered revealed another layer of her meticulous planning, a silent assertion of control that extended even beyond death. I remember sitting at the dining table late one night, James at my side, stacks of papers and spreadsheets spread around us, the soft hum of the overhead lamp illuminating our tense faces. She really thought she could control everything, even after she was gone, James murmured, rubbing his temples in frustration. I nodded, my eyes scanning the documents, noting the intricate language she had used, convoluted conditions, ambiguous instructions, and subtle loopholes that could be interpreted in multiple ways, all crafted to confuse and intimidate her heirs. It's more than control, I replied quietly. It's strategy. And it's going to take careful planning to untangle. Her manipulations were sophisticated, almost Machiavellian. She had placed restrictions on funds, created trusts under obscure names, and even inserted clauses that seemed to reward family members who acted according to her preferences, while subtly penalizing those she disfavored. Every financial decision we made became a delicate exercise in navigation. One wrong move, one misinterpreted document, could trigger legal complications or allow a seemingly minor clause to block our access to resources we were entitled to. It was a minefield, and the stakes were high, not just money, but security, dignity, and the very stability of James and my life together. I began to document everything meticulously. Each bank statement, each legal notice, each email from accountants or lawyers became part of a growing dossier, a blueprint for navigating her labyrinthine financial empire. I realized that knowledge was the only weapon we had against her posthumous manipulations. With every page I reviewed, I felt a mixture of outrage and resolve. Outrage at the cruelty and meticulousness of her planning, and resolve to reclaim what was rightfully ours, with intelligence, patience, and strategy as our allies. Her manipulations were not just bureaucratic, they were psychological. She had anticipated the emotional dynamics of her family, predicting how grief, loyalty, and hesitation could delay decisive action. Many of her clauses required family members to make requests in a specific tone, provide detailed explanations, or even agree to conditions that were subtly humiliating. It was a calculated game, designed to reinforce her dominance and keep her children and in-laws off balance long after her death. And yet, through careful observation and the evidence I had collected over months, I began to understand her system. I saw the patterns, the triggers, and the psychological levers she had employed to maintain power. One particular instance stood out vividly. A significant portion of her estate had been placed in a discretionary trust, controlled by a law firm she had favored for decades. The trust contained instructions that seemed arbitrary at first. Certain sums could be accessed only if the heir demonstrated specific behaviors, such as attending weekly social events she had enjoyed or showing appreciation for her favorite charities. At first glance, these instructions appeared benevolent or ceremonial, but it was clear to me that they were designed to create dependency and to subtly punish those who might resist her influence. I carefully mapped out these restrictions, highlighting potential loopholes and strategies for navigating her complex system. James was overwhelmed by the intricacies. "I can't believe she went to such lengths," he said one evening, staring at the spreadsheets, his voice tinged with disbelief and a hint of bitterness. "It's almost like she wanted to make us fail." I reached across the table and took his hand, reassuring him. "She wanted control, yes," I said, "but control is fragile. With patience and careful planning, we can navigate this. We just need to be deliberate, methodical, and always aware of her patterns. My tone was calm, but internally I felt a surge of determination. The injustice she had engineered would not succeed, not if I had anything to do with it. The financial manipulation also extended to subtle social pressures. Relatives would occasionally make comments, intentionally or unintentionally, about wealth, inheritance, or decisions James and I should make. I quickly learned to filter these distractions, focusing only on the concrete evidence and actionable steps. Every interaction became a test. I had to maintain composure, avoid emotional reactions that could compromise our position, and stay vigilant for hidden agendas. It was exhausting, but necessary. The stakes were too high for anything less than full awareness and strategy. I also began to prepare a psychological strategy, anticipating how we would confront these manipulations publicly. With the documentation I had gathered, the recordings of her cruel remarks, and James' growing awareness of her tactics, I realized we could not only navigate the financial labyrinth, but also expose the manipulative patterns she had used to control the family. Each carefully documented instance of her cruelty was a building block for a larger narrative, one that would eventually shift the balance of power decisively in our favor. By the end of those weeks, I had built a comprehensive plan. Each account, each clause, each subtle instruction was mapped, analyzed, and paired with a strategic response. I felt empowered, knowing that while her manipulations were sophisticated, they were not invincible. Knowledge, preparation, and precision had become my allies, transforming the fear and uncertainty she had designed into a tool for reclaiming agency. The tension between outrage and empowerment became a daily companion. While many mourned her passing superficially, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: sorrow for James, frustration at the injustice, and a growing sense of satisfaction knowing that the pieces of her carefully constructed control were now within my grasp. The financial manipulation, intended to intimidate and confuse, had inadvertently provided the blueprint for her ultimate undoing. And yet, as I looked at the towering piles of documents, spreadsheets, and legal correspondence, I knew the battle was far from over. Each day presented new challenges, each letter and bank notice a potential twist in the ongoing drama. Her manipulations were like a maze, intricate and intentionally confusing, but the path through it was becoming clear. Patience, strategy, and precise action would be our weapons, and the eventual exposure of her control and cruelty would be as satisfying as it was inevitable. By carefully navigating the labyrinth of accounts, trusts, and obscure clauses, we were slowly dismantling her posthumous control, piece by piece. Each small victory reinforced our confidence, strengthened our partnership, and illuminated the path toward justice. The financial manipulation, designed to intimidate, isolate, and control, had inadvertently created the conditions for a meticulously planned, inevitable reversal, a triumph built on patience, intelligence, and unwavering determination. And so, in the quiet moments after another long day of analyzing trusts, negotiating with lawyers, and decoding obscure instructions, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The battle for justice, dignity, and family integrity was far from over, but the tools, strategies, and understanding we had gained ensured that the next steps would be deliberate, precise, and ultimately victorious. The stage was set, the pieces aligned, and the reckoning for my mother-in-law's posthumous manipulations was only beginning. By the time the reality of my mother-in-law's manipulations fully sank in, a storm of emotions had taken hold of our household. James and I found ourselves navigating a labyrinth far more complicated than we had ever anticipated, a tangled web of grief, anger, guilt, and lingering resentment. Every morning brought with it a new wave of reflection. How much of his mother's behavior had been innocent eccentricity? How much had been calculated cruelty? And most importantly, how could we survive and thrive in the aftermath of a woman who had wielded control with such precision, both in life and beyond? The emotional turmoil was especially pronounced during quiet moments when the chaos of legal documents, financial complications, and family gossip subsided, leaving only raw feelings in their wake. I would sit at the kitchen table, staring at the steaming cup of coffee before me, and feel the weight of responsibility pressing down. James would pace the living room, muttering half-formed thoughts and questions, his mind clearly trying to reconcile the woman he had loved as a mother with the manipulations we were uncovering. "I can't believe she did all this, even after she was gone," he said one evening, voice heavy with frustration. I reached for his hand, offering what little comfort I could. "She wanted control. Yes, but we can't let it destroy us," I whispered, though inside I wrestled with my own doubts and simmering anger. The challenge was not merely external, it was internal. I struggled to balance my own emotional response with the need for strategic thinking. My anger at her cruelty and my satisfaction in uncovering her schemes collided with guilt over feeling relief at her passing. How could I reconcile mourning her death while recognizing that her absence allowed us the freedom to reclaim control of our lives? This tension gnawed at me, creating an almost constant mental tug-of-war between sorrow and vindication. Family interactions became exercises in emotional calculation. Every phone call, every visit, every seemingly innocuous comment from relatives had the potential to provoke a cascade of reactions. Some relatives were unaware of the manipulations, offering comfort while inadvertently perpetuating her subtle narrative of control. Others had suspected her cruelty but lacked evidence, and their frustration at discovering the truth added layers of complexity to our interactions. James and I found ourselves navigating these delicate dynamics carefully, always weighing the potential emotional impact of disclosure against the need to assert our rights and protect our future. The tension with James was particularly pronounced. His grief was a storm that could shift without warning, alternating between sorrow, anger, and moments of quiet reflection. At times, he seemed paralyzed by the realization that his mother's manipulations had left scars not just on the family's finances, but on his own emotional well-being. I tried to support him, offering calm reassurance and gentle guidance, but I also recognized that his emotional processing was a necessary journey, one that required patience, empathy, and understanding. Our relationship was tested in ways I had never anticipated, as we learned to confront past injustices while maintaining a united front. Every decision we made became emotionally charged. Even mundane choices, how to distribute household responsibilities, how to communicate with extended family, or how to plan for upcoming events, were tinged with emotional complexity. The presence of my mother-in-law's manipulative legacy loomed over us like a shadow, and every action felt weighted with significance. Should we assert control too quickly, risking confrontation and emotional fallout? Or should we act subtly, allowing time to reveal the truth and maintain composure? These questions consumed both our waking thoughts and restless nights. There were also moments of doubt and self-questioning. I asked myself repeatedly, had I handled the situation correctly? Had I been strategic enough, empathetic enough, patient enough? Could I have anticipated all of her manipulations sooner, or had I missed something critical? These reflections were exhausting, but they also sharpened my awareness, forcing me to think 2 steps ahead, to anticipate the emotional reactions of everyone involved, and to prepare for the inevitable confrontation that would ultimately reveal the truth. The emotional turbulence extended to interactions with her other family members. James' siblings, some loyal to their mother's memory, others quietly resentful, contributed to an environment of tension and unpredictability. Conversations were layered with unspoken judgments, veiled support, and occasional moments of raw honesty. During one such gathering, a cousin remarked casually, "You know, she always had her favorites," and the room went silent. That tiny phrase encapsulated the emotional undercurrents of the entire family: jealousy, resentment, fear, and the lingering effects of her manipulative ways. James and I exchanged a glance, silently agreeing that we had to navigate this carefully lest the situation spiral into unnecessary conflict or further emotional harm. Even our quietest moments were not immune. Late at night, I would lie awake beside James, feeling the weight of the day's revelations pressing on both of us. I sensed his mind racing, analyzing, reflecting, and trying to process the enormity of what we had uncovered. My own thoughts mirrored his, the betrayals, the injustices, the clever manipulations that had gone unnoticed for years. Yet within that emotional storm, there was also a glimmer of determination, a sense that we could rise above her legacy of control and emerge stronger, wiser, and more united. The emotional turmoil was compounded by the knowledge that her manipulations had far-reaching consequences, not just for us, but for the extended family and even friends who had been caught in subtle webs of deceit. Letters, financial decisions, and subtle instructions in her will had affected multiple lives, creating a ripple effect of uncertainty and tension. Every conversation, every meeting, every legal consultation brought to the surface new layers of emotional complexity, forcing us to confront not only the past but also the future she had tried to manipulate. Through it all, I discovered the importance of emotional resilience, strategic patience, and clear communication. I learned to acknowledge and validate James' feelings while maintaining focus on the practical steps necessary to counteract the manipulations. I learned to navigate family dynamics with care, anticipating reactions, and preparing for potential conflicts, all while managing my own emotions and sense of justice. And most importantly, I realized that emotional turmoil, though exhausting and challenging, was also a catalyst for growth, understanding, and the development of a strategic approach that would ultimately allow us to reclaim our lives from the shadow of her control. The culmination of this emotional turbulence came during a particularly heated discussion with James. The conversation began with a seemingly innocuous topic, a decision about household finances, but quickly escalated as emotions ran high. He expressed frustration at the lingering impact of his mother's manipulations, while I shared my own anger and sense of betrayal. Voices were raised, tears were shed, and yet amidst the chaos, a shared understanding emerged. We were in this together, and our combined strength, intelligence, and patience would allow us to navigate the storm she had left behind. Even as the days passed and the initial intensity of grief softened, the emotional complexity remained. Moments of joy were tinged with remembrance, moments of laughter occasionally interrupted by sudden flashes of frustration or sorrow. The legacy of her manipulation had created a landscape in which emotional responses were layered, nuanced, and sometimes unpredictable. And yet, through every wave of emotion, I felt a growing sense of empowerment, a recognition that the careful documentation, strategic patience, and quiet resilience we had cultivated would allow us to face the next stages of this story with clarity, purpose, and determination. The emotional turmoil was far from resolved, but it had forged a deeper bond between James and me. We had learned to communicate under pressure, to balance grief with strategy, and to navigate the complex terrain of family dynamics with empathy and intelligence. And in the quiet moments, as we reflected on the chaos, the injustices, and the subtle victories we had already achieved, I realized that emotional turmoil, though painful, had become the crucible through which our resilience, unity, and readiness for the ultimate confrontation would be forged. The storm of emotions would continue to challenge us, but it had also clarified our mission: to expose, confront, and ultimately reclaim control from the manipulations that had long governed our lives. Every pang of grief, every flash of anger, every whisper of guilt or doubt was part of a broader process, one that would culminate in justice, satisfaction, and the final reckoning for the mother-in-law whose cruelty had cast a shadow over our family for far too long. The moment I had been anticipating for months had finally arrived, the direct confrontation with my mother-in-law. Although she was physically gone, her presence lingered through the web of manipulations, the complex financial entanglements, and the emotional scars she had left in her wake. It was clear to me that any resolution required a deliberate, unflinching face-off, not with shouting or hysteria, but with evidence, patience, and undeniable authority. James and I had prepared meticulously, compiling recordings, documents, emails, and detailed notes of every cruel and manipulative word she had ever uttered, waiting for the precise moment to bring the truth into the open. The setting was strategic. The study, a room lined with dark oak shelves filled with legal books and family memorabilia, a space she had always claimed as a symbol of her intellect and control. I arranged everything carefully: the recording devices, the documents on the desk, the seating where James would sit beside me, and rehearsed the sequence of events in my mind, ensuring that every reaction, every pause, and every revelation would have maximum impact. The emotional tension was almost palpable, as if the room itself could sense the storm about to unfold. When she arrived, her expression was one of authority, a mix of indignation and expectation. "I hope you've behaved, and that you haven't overstepped," she said, her tone sharp but controlled, her eyes glinting with an almost predatory awareness. I maintained my calm, offering a polite smile. Actually, we have a lot to discuss, and I think it's time to clarify a few things. The words were simple, yet they carried weight. The weight of preparation, justice, and months of patient strategy. I began with small points, subtle reminders of her past actions that would gradually build a psychological picture of accountability. Remember the pantry last March? I asked softly, when you rearranged everything to assert control over the kitchen, even though I had already organized it according to James' preferences. Her lips tightened slightly, a flicker of recognition passing across her face. I was just helping, she replied curtly, but there was a tension underlying her words. Helping was a pattern she had always used to mask her control, and now it was being exposed as part of a larger narrative of manipulation. Then I presented the recordings, the cold, undeniable evidence of her cruel words and instructions. Her face changed, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and an almost imperceptible flush of guilt. You kept these, she stammered, her voice faltering. I nodded, calmly, deliberately. I did. Every word, every instruction, every subtle attempt to control us has been recorded and documented. The power dynamics shifted instantly. The room, once dominated by her aura of authority, now vibrated with the quiet authority of truth, of meticulous preparation, and of the eventual vindication of those she had sought to dominate. The confrontation intensified as I moved into financial manipulations. Each account, trust, and clause she had established to confuse and control us was laid bare. These restrictions, I said, pointing to the documents, were designed to manipulate, intimidate, and control. You anticipated our emotions, our loyalty, and even our grief. But every move you made has been anticipated and countered. James watched with a mixture of relief and awe, seeing the depth of preparation and the precision of strategy that had gone into this confrontation. The evidence was overwhelming, methodically dismantling the carefully constructed facade she had maintained for decades. Her reaction was a complex mix of denial, indignation, and fleeting vulnerability. I only wanted what was best, she exclaimed, a tremor of genuine frustration in her voice. I shook my head gently. What you wanted was control, and the truth is clear. Your attempts to dominate and manipulate have been documented, and the consequences are yours to face. Every word was measured, every pause deliberate, each sentence building the undeniable weight of accountability. I could see the shift, finally, the realization that her power had limits, that her cruelty was no longer invisible, and that her carefully cultivated dominance was being systematically dismantled. The confrontation also addressed emotional manipulation. I recounted incidents of favoritism, subtle disparagement, and calculated criticism, each illustrated with specific examples. You told James he would never inherit a dime, threatened family members, and created divisions intentionally, I said calmly. Her gaze faltered, the bravado slipping for just a moment as the sheer accumulation of evidence became undeniable. The room, once charged with tension from her presence, now resonated with clarity, with truth, and with the quiet satisfaction that justice, even if delayed, was finally taking its rightful course. Even her attempts to justify herself were countered with calm logic and factual evidence. I laid out emails, receipts, and accounts showing how she had manipulated financial flows to reward certain behaviors and punish others. Each revelation was precise, unemotional, and devastatingly effective. James, witnessing the exposition, finally saw the full scope of the psychological and financial control she had wielded. It was a cathartic moment, a blend of grief, relief, and empowerment that crystallized our understanding of her manipulations and our own strength in response. The confrontation reached its peak as I addressed her final, cruelest manipulations. The will, the trusts, and the deliberate obfuscations designed to prevent us from receiving what was rightfully ours. I presented the complete timeline, documented conversations, and recorded statements, each linked to a specific clause or instruction. Every act of cruelty, every subtle attempt to control, every word spoken in malice has been recorded, I said firmly. Your power was never absolute, and now it is exposed. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Her composure wavered, the veneer of dominance cracking under the weight of meticulous truth. And yet, throughout the confrontation, I maintained composure. Calm, measured, and unyielding, I let the evidence speak for itself. There was no yelling, no hysteria, only the undeniable force of preparation and truth. The subtle smiles, the raised eyebrows, and the quiet moments of hesitation revealed that the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The mother-in-law, who had once dictated every household decision, every conversation, and every subtle power play, was now confronted with the full, inescapable consequences of her cruelty. By the time the confrontation ended, the atmosphere in the study had transformed completely. The room, once a symbol of her control and intellect, now bore witness to the reversal of power. Every document, every recording, every calculated move we had made was a testament to patience, strategy, and resilience. James and I emerged not only victorious but also more deeply connected, having navigated an emotionally charged, complex confrontation together. The direct confrontation had not only exposed her manipulations but had also validated months of preparation, careful observation, and strategic patience. Every subtle act of revenge, every documented cruelty, and every calculated step had culminated in a moment of undeniable clarity. The mother-in-law's reign of control, meticulously crafted over decades, was dismantled, piece by piece, through intelligence, patience, and emotional fortitude. As we left the study, the air felt lighter, yet the lessons of the confrontation lingered. The emotional intensity, the careful strategy, and the meticulous preparation had forged a sense of empowerment and closure. The battle was not merely for finances or family dynamics, it was for dignity, respect, and the assertion of self against a legacy of manipulation. The direct confrontation was complete, but its effects would ripple through our lives for years to come, a reminder that patience, preparation, and courage could dismantle even the most carefully constructed webs of control. Even though my mother-in-law was no longer physically present, her influence lingered like a shadow, and the direct confrontation we had staged brought that shadow into sharp relief. The moment I played the recordings and presented every piece of evidence of her manipulations, her essence seemed to fill the room, a spectral presence that was both formidable and fragile. It was as if she were watching, somewhere, unseen but omnipresent, and the impact of her words, the cruel tone, the strategic cruelty, the veiled threats, was now bouncing back at her with undeniable clarity. I could almost feel her shock, her frustration, and perhaps even a faint trace of regret, all transmitted through the tangible effect it had on the family gathered with us. James sat beside me, gripping my hand, his eyes wide with a mixture of relief and vindication. I could sense the internal chaos that must be unfolding in her mind. If she had been alive to witness this revelation, it would have shattered the carefully constructed persona she had relied upon for so long. She must be furious, James whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. I nodded, my lips pressed tightly together, savoring the quiet triumph that had been months in the making. The recordings, the documents, and the careful strategy we had employed had stripped away her power, leaving her vulnerabilities exposed in a way that I could only imagine. Her reaction, or what I perceived of it, was layered and complex. I envisioned her sitting in a room of her own making, reviewing her notes, realizing that her manipulations, once invisible, were now laid bare. Her carefully crafted authority, the web of subtle emotional and financial control she had woven, was collapsing, thread by thread. I imagined the incredulity in her eyes as she saw the culmination of our patience, diligence, and strategy, recognizing that for all her cunning, there had been one person who could outmaneuver her, me, her daughter-in-law. The power of anticipation magnified the effect. Every family member present reacted to the confrontation, and their silent acknowledgement was a mirror of her unseen reaction. Shock, awe, frustration, and vindication mingled in the air. I could see in James' siblings the dawning comprehension of what had transpired, and I imagined her fury at seeing her carefully controlled narrative unravel before the very people she had sought to dominate. Her reaction, though unseen, was palpable through the tremor of emotion surrounding us, the hushed conversations, and the glances exchanged among relatives. As I presented the final evidence, The most damning of all, her reaction, imagined in vivid detail, was almost cinematic. I pictured her pacing, tense and agitated, muttering under her breath, trying to devise some last-minute strategy to reclaim control. Perhaps she even felt a fleeting sense of guilt, though it would be quickly smothered by pride and indignation. The duality of her emotions, frustration at losing control and admiration, begrudging or otherwise, for our meticulous execution, was a testament to the complexity of her personality. She had always been brilliant in her schemes, but brilliance alone could not withstand the combination of patience, strategy, and evidence. The recordings were the ultimate catalyst for her reaction. Each word she had spoken, each veiled threat, each cruel instruction played back like a mirror reflecting the true nature of her behavior. Her imagined expressions shifted from denial to disbelief, from indignation to fleeting vulnerability. I could almost see her lips pressing into a thin line, her hands clenching in subtle frustration, the careful facade she had maintained for decades finally cracking. Her reaction, though entirely internal, reverberated in the room, a tangible tension that hung in the air as family members absorbed the impact of the revelations. I also imagined her trying to rationalize her actions, as she often had in life, creating mental justifications for every cruel word, every manipulative gesture. Perhaps she told herself that she was testing our resilience, that she was preparing us for the real world, that she had acted out of love, but the evidence I presented rendered those justifications hollow. The clarity of documented truth, the undeniable proof of strategy and intent, left no room for subjective interpretation. Her imagined frustration grew, knowing that no amount of rationalization could erase the consequences of her calculated cruelty. James, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, whispered to me, "I can almost feel her boiling even now." I smiled faintly, squeezing his hand. "Yes," I replied softly, "and that's exactly the power we now hold. Her words, her cruelty, her manipulations, they are no longer invisible. We've turned them into tools, into truth, and she can't undo that." The imagined turmoil she experienced was satisfying not because I relished her anger, but because it represented justice finally delivered, a reckoning for years of subtle, insidious control. The reactions of extended family members amplified the sense of her imagined fury. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, glances were exchanged, and subtle acknowledgments were made regarding the thoroughness of our preparation. I could almost hear her internal voice, furious, frustrated, incredulous at how she had been outmaneuvered in ways that were both strategic and compassionate. Every carefully documented detail, every recorded cruelty, every meticulously laid plan contributed to the imagined crescendo of her emotional response, a blend of shock, irritation, and begrudging respect. Her imagined response also carried a sense of incredulity. How could anyone, particularly a daughter-in-law she had sought to belittle, have anticipated and countered her every maneuver? The recognition of our meticulous planning, combined with the undeniable evidence of her cruelty, would have been a bitter pill for her to swallow. In my mind's eye, I pictured her sitting back, momentarily frozen, realizing that her legacy of control had been challenged and ultimately overturned through patience, strategy, and careful documentation. Even as I imagined her reaction, I felt a deep sense of resolution. The confrontation had been more than an assertion of truth. It had been an act of empowerment, a reclaiming of dignity, and a transformation of grief into agency. Her reaction, fictive though it was, served as a mirror reflecting the effectiveness of our actions. She was no longer the unseen manipulator controlling the family from the shadows. She had been confronted, exposed, and her influence neutralized. The complexity of her imagined emotions, anger, shock, frustration, fleeting guilt, and even grudging admiration, highlighted the full scope of her personality and the depth of the strategy required to confront it. Each imagined reaction reinforced the effectiveness of our preparation, the power of evidence, and the inevitability of justice. I realized, in that moment, that her reaction, though intangible, was as crucial to the narrative as any tangible victory. It validated every calculated step we had taken, every recorded word, and every document meticulously collected over months. In the end, the imagined turmoil of her reaction was almost cinematic in its intensity. The fury, the frustration, the incredulity, and the fleeting acknowledgement of our skill and determination created a mental tableau that mirrored the satisfaction we felt internally. Her reaction, though unseen, had been anticipated, countered, and ultimately neutralized through strategy, preparation, and patience. It was the invisible, yet powerful, affirmation that justice had been served, that the manipulations and cruelty she had wielded for so long had been revealed, and that the legacy of control she had sought to maintain had been decisively challenged. By the time we left the room, the imagined storm of her reaction had subsided into a quiet, almost respectful acknowledgement of the inevitable. The satisfaction was profound, not rooted in vengeance, but in the clarity and fairness of having revealed the truth, confronted the manipulations, and reclaimed control over our lives. The mother-in-law's reaction, though existing only in our minds, served as both closure and a reminder that preparation, patience, and meticulous planning could overcome even the most carefully orchestrated webs of cruelty. The long, exhausting journey toward justice had finally reached a turning point. Every sleepless night spent documenting her manipulations, every moment of patience during emotional turmoil, and every strategic step in navigating the labyrinth of her financial and psychological control had led us to this critical moment. The mother-in-law, whose cruelty had once seemed omnipotent, was now powerless, exposed, and accountable. James and I felt a mixture of relief, triumph, and quiet satisfaction that was both profound and deeply cathartic. The feeling of having navigated this intricate web of deceit, manipulation, and emotional pressure to a point of resolution was unparalleled. It began subtly, with the distribution of the estate according to the rightful legal interpretations we had painstakingly prepared for. Every clause she had twisted, every loophole she had designed to favor herself or obscure heirs, was carefully countered with evidence and strategy. As the executor of her will reluctantly acknowledged our claims, a sense of calm authority replaced the anxiety that had once permeated every interaction. "It's finally happening," James whispered one evening, eyes reflecting both relief and disbelief. "All those months of planning, preparation, and patience, it's paying off." I smiled, a quiet, controlled satisfaction. "Justice is never immediate," I replied, "but it's inevitable when truth and strategy align." The legal confirmations were just the beginning. Family dynamics shifted dramatically once the truth was laid bare and her manipulations were exposed. Relatives who had been skeptical or hesitant now witnessed the evidence in full clarity. The impact was visible in their expressions: surprise, understanding, and in some cases, guilt for having unknowingly participated in or ignored the subtle manipulations. Every subtle act of cruelty, every hidden strategy she had employed to dominate or destabilize us, was now openly recognized, and the balance of power had decisively shifted. I vividly remember the day the final court documents were signed and the official statements delivered. James and I arrived at the law office early, the morning light filtering through tall windows, illuminating the polished wood and marble surfaces. Our hands, clenched together for reassurance, reflected the unity and determination we had cultivated over months of tension and strategizing. The lawyer, a seasoned professional, handed us the finalized papers with a solemn nod. "Everything is in order," she said. "The estate, the trusts, the inheritances, all claims have been validated and distributed according to legal interpretation. There's no further contest possible." The words landed like a thunderclap and simultaneously washed over us with a wave of relief and quiet triumph. The psychological component of justice was equally profound. For years, her subtle threats, disparaging remarks, and manipulative tactics had created an invisible weight, shaping our daily decisions and interactions. Her cruel words had lingered in the background, a constant reminder of the imbalance of power. Now, with each documented revelation, each recorded phrase, and each carefully compiled piece of evidence, that weight had lifted. The emotional freedom that came with justice was almost palpable, transforming our interactions with each other and with extended family. I can still recall the first family gathering after the resolution, a small, private dinner at our home. The atmosphere was markedly different, lighter, calmer, more genuine. There were no hidden agendas, no subtle attempts at control, no whispered comparisons. Family members interacted openly, aware that the manipulations that had once influenced their behaviors were now exposed and powerless. I observed James, relax for the first time in months, smiling freely and engaging without fear of judgment or interference. The victory was not just legal or financial, it was emotional and relational, restoring a sense of balance and fairness that had been absent for far too long. The process of justice also included a subtle but powerful act of moral vindication. I organized the documents, recordings, and evidence into a clear narrative, presenting them to family members in a measured, factual manner. The impact was profound. Those who had once doubted the subtle cruelty, who had perhaps been manipulated themselves, could no longer ignore the truth. The realization that we had acted with integrity, strategy, and patience to counteract years of manipulation garnered respect and acknowledgement. Even those who had been aligned with her for decades were forced to reassess their assumptions and understandings. Interestingly, the satisfaction of justice was not merely in the exposure of her manipulations, but in the reversal of her control. Decisions that she had sought to influence were now firmly in our hands. The financial autonomy, emotional freedom, and restored family cohesion became living proof of our strategy's success. The mother-in-law's carefully constructed edifice of dominance had crumbled, not through retaliation, but through meticulous preparation, patience, and unwavering determination. Every document we had gathered, every recording we had preserved, and every subtle maneuver we had planned contributed to this decisive shift. There were moments of quiet reflection amidst the resolution, when I could process the magnitude of what had been achieved. I thought of the months of emotional turmoil, sleepless nights, and strategic planning. I remember the confrontations, the careful navigation of family dynamics, and the delicate balance between patience and action. The realization that justice had been served was deeply satisfying, not because it delivered revenge, but because it restored fairness, dignity, and a sense of equilibrium that had been absent for far too long. James and I also recognized that justice, though achieved, required ongoing vigilance. Her manipulations had left behind subtle echoes, patterns that could resurface if ignored. But armed with knowledge, preparation, and the lessons learned from months of careful observation and strategy, we felt confident in our ability to prevent any future attempts at control. The empowerment we felt was both practical and psychological, a combination of agency and emotional resilience that fortified us for whatever challenges might arise. The final moments of justice were punctuated by a quiet but profound sense of closure. The estate was settled, the financial manipulations neutralized, and the family dynamics restored to a healthier equilibrium. James and I reflected on our journey together, recognizing that our unity, patience, and careful strategy had been instrumental in transforming a scenario steeped in manipulation and cruelty into one of empowerment, fairness, and resolution. Every step of the process reinforced the lesson that justice, when pursued with intelligence and integrity, could overcome even the most entrenched systems of control. In the weeks that followed, the impact of justice extended beyond the immediate family. Relatives, friends, and acquaintances observed the shift, noticing the clarity, calm, and confidence we now displayed. The legacy of manipulation, once pervasive and invisible, had been exposed and neutralized. Our victory was not loud or vindictive. It was subtle, enduring, and profoundly effective. The mother-in-law's attempts at domination, cunning, and control had been met not with retaliation, but with strategy, patience, and ultimately justice. As I looked back on the journey, from the early days of suspicion and tension, through months of meticulous planning, emotional turmoil, direct confrontation, and finally to resolution, I felt a deep, abiding sense of accomplishment. Justice had been served, not just in legal and financial terms, but emotionally and morally. The mother-in-law's cruel words, manipulations, and attempts at control had been countered decisively, and in their place, dignity, fairness, and empowerment had been restored. Finally, the family could breathe again, unshackled from the invisible chains of manipulation. Our triumph was comprehensive, nuanced, and deeply satisfying, a testament to patience, strategy, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. The mother-in-law's legacy of control had been dismantled, her manipulative influence nullified, and our lives, both financial and emotional, restored. The sense of closure was profound, the lessons enduring, and the empowerment complete. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. After the storm of confrontation, revelation, and justice, the next chapter was about rebuilding relationships, a task that, surprisingly, required just as much patience, strategy, and emotional intelligence as the battles that had come before. The family had been fractured by years of manipulation, cruel words, and subtle emotional control, and though the mother-in-law's influence had been neutralized, the scars she had left behind were still visible. Every interaction carried echoes of her interference. Every conversation needed careful navigation to ensure old patterns of resentment, fear, or mistrust did not resurface. I realized quickly that while justice had restored fairness, it had not automatically restored harmony. Rebuilding required deliberate effort, empathy, and ongoing vigilance. I began with James. Our bond, though tested repeatedly, had emerged stronger after the confrontation. We spent hours reflecting on the months of tension, strategizing about how to protect our marriage from future interference, and reaffirming our commitment to one another. I wanted James to feel secure not only in our emotional partnership, but also in our ability to jointly manage family dynamics. We discussed every scenario, from casual visits with extended family to the subtleties of financial conversations and household decisions. The process was meticulous but necessary. Trust needed reinforcement, and open communication was key. I encouraged James to express his feelings freely, his anger, relief, lingering frustration, and even guilt over past inactions, all without fear of judgment. Slowly, we rebuilt the intimate foundation of our relationship, layer by layer, acknowledging the past but choosing not to let it dominate our future. Rebuilding relationships with extended family was an equally delicate process. Many relatives had been silent witnesses to the mother-in-law's cruelty, some complicit through inaction, others manipulated to see the world her way. Now, with the truth out in the open, these individuals were confronted not only with facts but also with their own role in allowing the manipulation to continue. I approached these interactions with a balance of firmness and empathy. I made it clear that the past could not be changed, but the future was ours to shape together. Conversations were honest, occasionally tense, yet ultimately productive. Slowly, walls of defensiveness began to crumble. Family members started to engage more authentically, no longer constrained by fear of her judgment or disapproval. Part of rebuilding relationships involved repairing the emotional landscape at home. James and I established new routines, small rituals that reinforced unity, security, and shared purpose. Simple acts, like having dinner together without distractions, sharing responsibilities transparently, and discussing family matters openly, became critical touchpoints. These routines symbolized stability and safety, contrasting sharply with the previous atmosphere dominated by manipulation and subtle fear. Emotional safety became the new cornerstone of our household, a tangible reminder that while the past could not be erased, the present and future were ours to control. We also began addressing the lingering insecurities among younger family members, particularly nieces and nephews, who had observed tension and emotional turbulence for years. It was clear that even subtle exposure to the mother-in-law's cruelty had impacted their understanding of family dynamics, trust, and loyalty. We hosted small gatherings, created opportunities for open dialogue, and encouraged expressions of feelings without judgment. Over time, the younger generation began to see that family bonds could be nurtured in a healthy, supportive environment, where love, honesty, and respect replaced fear, manipulation, and cruelty. These interactions were slow but meaningful, providing an essential foundation for emotional healing and future resilience. In addition to emotional rebuilding, we focused on practical matters. Shared responsibilities, financial planning, and household management were carefully redistributed to ensure that no single person could dominate or manipulate outcomes. Transparency became the guiding principle. Every family decision, whether related to finances, property, or significant life events, was made collaboratively with clear documentation and open discussion. The shadow of manipulation, which had once hovered over every decision, was replaced by clarity, fairness, and mutual respect. Family members began to trust that their voices mattered and that decisions would be made with integrity rather than coercion. Another key element of rebuilding was forgiveness, not for her sake, but for our own peace of mind. We acknowledged that holding on to anger, bitterness, or resentment toward the mother-in-law, or those who had been complicit, would only perpetuate the emotional damage. Forgiveness, therefore, was strategic as well as emotional. It allowed us to move forward without the weight of constant negativity. This did not mean condoning past cruelty. Rather, it meant choosing not to let it dictate the tone of our present relationships. The act of forgiveness freed us, empowered us, and reinforced the family's capacity for growth and resilience. Gradually, as the weeks turned into months, the atmosphere in our home transformed. Where tension and fear had once dominated, now there was laughter, genuine conversation, and moments of spontaneous joy. Family gatherings became occasions for connection rather than caution. Extended relatives, seeing the change, adjusted their behavior and engaged more authentically. Even those who had been skeptical or resistant at first began to recognize the benefits of transparent communication, mutual respect, and shared decision-making. The mother-in-law's absence, once a source of lingering anxiety, now served as a reminder that while her influence had been powerful, it was not insurmountable. One of the most striking moments in this rebuilding process was witnessing James' own transformation. He moved from a state of cautious, sometimes defensive engagement with family to a more open, confident presence. I saw him reclaiming his voice, asserting boundaries, and supporting younger family members in navigating their own experiences with manipulation or intimidation. His growth was a testament to the power of preparation, patience, and collaboration in overcoming emotional oppression. Together, we were not only rebuilding relationships but also cultivating leadership, confidence, and emotional resilience within our family. The extended family, observing our methods and the outcomes, began to mirror our approach. Older relatives who had once wielded subtle influence now respected boundaries and recognized the value of honesty, fairness, and empathy. Sibling rivalries and minor disputes, once exacerbated by hidden manipulations, began to resolve more naturally. Family cohesion, long fractured by fear and manipulation, started to solidify. Our home became a model of relational balance, emotionally safe, strategically managed, and morally clear. Rebuilding also meant acknowledging the past without being consumed by it. I encouraged family members to share stories, feelings, and memories, even those tainted by manipulation, so that we could process and integrate them into our collective narrative. These discussions, though occasionally uncomfortable, were therapeutic. They allowed us to separate the actions of the mother-in-law from our own identities and relationships, empowering each individual to reclaim agency over their emotions and choices. One subtle but important aspect of rebuilding was the establishment of new traditions, rituals that symbolized resilience, unity, and fairness. Family dinners, collaborative holiday planning, and even simple weekend projects became touchpoints for trust building and shared responsibility. These rituals, grounded in transparency and mutual respect, replaced the covert manipulations and subtle control mechanisms that had previously dominated our interactions. Over time, they became an intrinsic part of our family culture, reinforcing the values of honesty, integrity, and emotional support. Throughout this rebuilding process, I reflected on the lessons we had learned. The mother-in-law's cruelty had forced us to develop resilience, strategy, and emotional intelligence. Her manipulations, though harmful, catalyzed the growth of patience, communication, and assertiveness within the family. Each restored relationship, each moment of trust, and each expression of genuine emotion became a tangible marker of progress. The pain she inflicted could not be erased, but it had been transformed into a force for personal and familial growth. Ultimately, rebuilding relationships was about reclaiming agency and restoring balance. The family, once dominated by fear and subtle coercion, now operated within a framework of mutual respect, transparent communication, and shared responsibility. James and I emerged not only as partners, but also as anchors for our family, guiding the emotional, practical, and relational rebuilding with consistency, fairness, and empathy. The mother-in-law's legacy of cruelty, though indelible in memory, had been neutralized in practice, replaced by a living network of trust, connection, and emotional resilience. By the end of his chapter, the family had achieved something profound. A redefined sense of unity, trust, and emotional security. Relationships were being rebuilt, not superficially, but with depth, honesty, and intentionality. The lessons learned, the strategies implemented, and the emotional work undertaken had transformed not only the immediate family, but also the extended network of relatives. The mother-in-law's absence was no longer a source of lingering anxiety, but a testament to the power of patience, preparation, and unwavering commitment to justice, truth, and relational healing. After the dust of confrontation had settled and justice had been delivered, I found myself facing an entirely different challenge, reflecting on the complex interplay between revenge and forgiveness. The journey we had undertaken was long, emotionally exhausting, and fraught with moral dilemmas. Every decision, from recording her cruel words to carefully navigating family dynamics, had been motivated not solely by anger or the desire for retribution, but by the necessity to restore balance and protect those I loved. As I sat quietly one evening, reflecting on the months of strategy, tension, and emotional upheaval, I realized that vengeance and forgiveness were not mutually exclusive, but rather intertwined forces, each shaping the trajectory of our lives in profound ways. Revenge had been a silent, calculated companion throughout the ordeal. It was not the blind, impulsive type often portrayed in stories, but a measured, deliberate strategy that sought to correct injustices and expose manipulation. The mother-in-law had wielded her cruelty like a weapon for years, using her words and actions to undermine our confidence, influence decisions, and dominate family dynamics. Every subtle insult, every manipulative suggestion, and every attempt to sway loyalties had left scars that could not be ignored. Revenge, in our context, was a form of accountability, a method to ensure that her cruelty no longer held power over our lives. It was a disciplined, ethical response designed to achieve justice, not simply to inflict suffering. Yet even as we executed our plan, I began to confront the deeper emotional implications of revenge. Holding on to anger, even for strategic purposes, carried its own burdens. Each day spent recalling her manipulations, replaying her cruel words, and calculating every move required immense emotional energy. I realized that revenge, while empowering in its strategic form, could also become a weight if it morphed into obsession. I had to constantly remind myself that the goal was not to perpetuate cycles of pain, but to reclaim autonomy, restore dignity, and re-establish balance within the family. The careful orchestration of justice had to be accompanied by conscious emotional management, lest the desire for retribution overshadow the ultimate objective, healing. Forgiveness, by contrast, emerged as both a balm and a strategic tool. Unlike revenge, forgiveness was not about punishing the mother-in-law or condoning her actions. It was about releasing the psychological grip she had held over us for so long. Forgiveness allowed us to reclaim mental space, to move beyond the fear, resentment, and frustration that had defined so many interactions. It was a conscious choice, an intentional act of liberation rather than submission. By forgiving, not for her benefit, but for our own emotional freedom, we could begin to rebuild relationships with family members who had been influenced or intimidated by her behavior. Forgiveness became a way to break the lingering chains of control and create an environment where love, trust, and collaboration could flourish. The delicate balance between revenge and forgiveness was highlighted in everyday life. For instance, when a distant cousin commented on the resolution of the estate, noting how brutal the exposure of the mother-in-law's manipulations had been, I smiled faintly and responded, "It wasn't about brutality, it was about truth and clarity." My response reflected the dual nature of our approach. We had held the mother-in-law accountable without allowing hatred to dominate our actions, and we had simultaneously cultivated the capacity for forgiveness to heal the residual emotional damage. Every conversation, every decision, and every interaction in those weeks became a practical exercise. In navigating this balance, teaching both James and me the nuanced power of strategic patience, moral clarity, and emotional intelligence. In reflecting on the journey, I began to understand that revenge without forgiveness is hollow. It may satisfy a momentary sense of justice, but without the release of lingering resentment, it can perpetuate cycles of emotional strain. Conversely, forgiveness without accountability risks enabling further manipulation or injustice. The interplay of these forces, when applied thoughtfully and deliberately, creates a pathway toward both empowerment and healing. I recognize that our victory had been sustainable because we had not allowed revenge to devolve into malice, nor had we pursued forgiveness at the expense of truth. The equilibrium between these forces had restored not only justice but also emotional integrity, both individually and collectively. Family discussions became a crucible for practicing this balance. Relatives who had been skeptical of our strategy or hesitant to confront the mother-in-law's manipulations began to see the value in measured accountability coupled with emotional release. I encouraged them to articulate their feelings honestly, acknowledging both anger and the possibility of letting go. These conversations were often difficult. Old habits of fear, guilt, or misplaced loyalty emerged, but gradually, through transparency, empathy, and consistent reinforcement of ethical principles, family members internalized the concept that justice and forgiveness were complementary, not contradictory. I also found myself reflecting on the moral lessons for the next generation. Young family members, who had witnessed tension, manipulation, and eventual resolution, were now learning that strength, patience, and strategic intelligence could confront cruelty effectively. More importantly, they were seeing that the most powerful victories are those that integrate ethical judgment, empathy, and foresight. By modeling the balance between revenge and forgiveness, we imparted lessons about resilience, justice, and emotional literacy that would resonate for years to come. This realization transformed my own perspective. The journey had not only been about neutralizing the mother-in-law's influence, but also about shaping a healthier, more emotionally intelligent family culture for the future. The reflection also included a deep personal reckoning. I acknowledged the times when anger flared, when frustration threatened to overpower reason, and when the desire for immediate retaliation tempted me to act impulsively. Recognizing these impulses allowed me to refine my approach, ensuring that every action was deliberate, ethical, and aligned with long-term objectives. In many ways, the mother-in-law had inadvertently trained me to be more strategic, more patient, and more emotionally resilient. The realization that personal growth had emerged from such a toxic environment was both ironic and profoundly satisfying. As I reflected further, I considered the broader implications of revenge and forgiveness in human relationships. Life inevitably presents conflicts, betrayals, and injustices, yet how we respond shapes not only immediate outcomes but also long-term emotional health and relational stability. The mother-in-law's cruelty had provided a stark, albeit painful, illustration of this principle. By combining calculated accountability with deliberate forgiveness, we were able to restore balance, protect loved ones, and cultivate a resilient emotional environment. The lesson was clear. Justice alone may correct external wrongs, but the integration of forgiveness transforms internal landscapes, ensuring that resolution is not only practical but also emotionally sustainable. Finally, I understood that the journey toward balancing revenge and forgiveness was ongoing. It was not a single act, but a continuous practice of vigilance, reflection, and intentionality. Each family interaction, each decision about trust or transparency, required conscious awareness of the delicate equilibrium we had achieved. Yet, for the first time in years, I felt a profound sense of agency, clarity, and inner peace. Revenge had served its purpose. It had exposed cruelty and restored justice. Forgiveness had served its purpose. It had liberated our emotions, restored dignity, and created the conditions for relational healing. The two forces, once seemingly opposed, now existed in harmony, guiding us toward a future defined not by past manipulation, but by conscious choice, ethical action, and emotional integrity. In the end, reflecting on revenge and forgiveness, I realized that the mother-in-law's cruelty, though deeply damaging, had inadvertently catalyzed a journey of personal growth, relational restoration, and moral clarity. By navigating the interplay between accountability and emotional release, we had achieved not only justice but also empowerment, resilience, and the capacity to rebuild a family grounded in integrity, respect, and love. The experience had been arduous, painful, and transformative, and its lessons would echo through our lives for decades to come. As the final chapters of our family saga settled into memory, I realized that the story we had lived through, fraught with manipulation, cruelty, confrontation, justice, and reconciliation, was no longer merely an episode of personal struggle. It had transformed into a legacy, a series of lessons and principles that would reverberate through our family for generations. The mother-in-law, once a seemingly invincible presence whose cruel words had dictated emotions and behavior, was now an absence that carried a paradoxical weight. Her actions had sparked growth, resilience, and an enduring sense of agency among those she had sought to dominate. The legacy of her cruelty was not in continued harm, but in the strength, wisdom, and vigilance it had forced upon us. I often reflect on the way each phase of our journey contributed to this legacy. From the initial signs of tension, through daily life under subtle oppression, to the dramatic revelations, confrontations, and eventual triumph of justice, every moment became a building block. We had learned to document, strategize, and act with both ethical clarity and emotional intelligence. Each experience, painful as it was, had created a blueprint for navigating conflict, understanding human behavior, and protecting oneself and one's loved ones from toxic influence. This blueprint, I realized, was a gift we could pass down, a tangible inheritance more valuable than wealth or property. It would teach future generations that courage, patience, and moral integrity are as critical as any legal or financial strategy. The emotional dimension of this legacy was equally profound. Our family, once fragmented by fear, manipulation, and subtle coercion, had now been reshaped into a network of trust, respect, and intentional connection. James and I had become anchors, guiding not through dominance but through example. Younger family members witnessed firsthand how one could confront cruelty with strategy, protect oneself and loved ones, and restore relationships with care and empathy. They learned that power does not require intimidation and that moral and emotional strength could neutralize even the most persistent attempts at control. This knowledge, intangible yet profoundly impactful, became part of our family culture, a legacy of emotional literacy and resilience. One of the most enduring lessons of this journey was the delicate balance between accountability and forgiveness. The mother-in-law's actions had necessitated a careful navigation between revenge and release, demonstrating that justice without reflection could become hollow, while forgiveness without accountability could empower further wrongdoing. This duality became a cornerstone of our legacy. It taught us, and by extension, all who witnessed or learned of our journey, that facing injustice with strategic action, followed by intentional emotional release, transforms conflict into growth rather than perpetuating cycles of harm. It became clear that our story was no longer just ours. It was a guide, a reference, and a moral compass for generations to come. Financially and legally, the legacy was equally instructive. By carefully documenting the mother-in-law's manipulations and ensuring that the estate and inheritance were distributed fairly, we not only protected our immediate interests but also demonstrated the importance of vigilance, preparation, and transparency. Family members learned that wealth and property, though valuable, are vulnerable without oversight and clear documentation. They saw that power could be exercised responsibly, with integrity, and that legal and financial systems, when leveraged thoughtfully, could reinforce fairness rather than perpetuate abuse. The legacy of knowledge, strategy, and foresight became a guidepost, ensuring that future conflicts of a similar nature could be navigated successfully. Emotionally, the journey left a lasting imprint on our family culture. Where fear, distrust, and resentment had once lingered, there was now an emphasis on open communication, empathy, and mutual support. The lessons of the past, particularly the consequences of manipulation, cruelty, and passive complicity, were preserved not as stories of victimhood, but as teachings of resilience and moral courage. Family members now approached one another with awareness, patience, and intentionality, mindful of past mistakes, and equipped with strategies to maintain healthy, balanced relationships. The legacy was not only about surviving cruelty, but thriving beyond it. Socially, the story also created a ripple effect. Extended relatives, friends, and acquaintances who observed the resolution and transformation of our family learned the value of integrity, courage, and strategic emotional intelligence. They saw that confrontation need not be chaotic or destructive if approached thoughtfully, and that fairness and justice could coexist with forgiveness and compassion. This ripple effect, subtle yet powerful, ensured that the lessons of our story reached beyond the immediate household, influencing a broader network of relationships and shaping perceptions of conflict resolution, justice, and ethical behavior. The legacy also included a renewed sense of identity for James and me. We had been tested in ways we could never have anticipated, facing moral dilemmas, emotional turbulence, and practical challenges that demanded our utmost attention and strategic thinking. Emerging from this experience, we possessed not only the relief of justice but also the confidence of agency, the knowledge that we could navigate adversity, protect those we loved, and restore harmony without sacrificing integrity. This personal legacy, deeply intertwined with the family's legacy, reinforced a cycle of growth, resilience, and moral clarity that would guide us in all future challenges. One of the most poignant aspects of this legacy was the recognition that cruelty, though painful, can catalyze transformation. The mother-in-law's harsh words, manipulations, and attempts to dominate had inadvertently prompted an evolution in our family. We developed stronger bonds, deeper understanding, and more robust emotional intelligence than we had possessed before. The hardships she imposed became instruments of growth, proving that even toxic experiences can carry hidden value if approached with reflection, strategy, and integrity. This realization became a core component of our family narrative, a story to be told, remembered, and learned from. As I look toward the future, the legacy of this story feels both protective and aspirational. It safeguards us against future manipulations, equips the next generation with emotional and strategic tools, and instills a culture of resilience, fairness, and moral clarity. It is a legacy not of bitterness, but of empowerment, not of revenge, but of principled victory, not of fear, but of knowledge and preparedness. The story is preserved not merely in memory but in practice, guiding behaviors, relationships, and decisions for years to come. Finally, I recognize that this legacy is dynamic. It evolves as we continue to apply the lessons learned, model integrity and emotional intelligence, and nurture the bonds we have rebuilt. It is not static. It requires ongoing effort, reflection, and vigilance. But its presence is unmistakable, a testament to resilience, justice, and the transformative power of confronting cruelty with wisdom, patience, and moral courage. The story of our struggle, confrontation, and ultimate triumph has become a living inheritance, shaping both who we are and who our family will become. Even now, when I recount the story to others or reflect quietly in the evening light, I feel the weight and the power of its legacy. It is a story of pain transformed into wisdom, of cruelty converted into clarity, and of fear replaced by strength. The mother-in-law's shadow, once suffocating, now illuminates the path we have forged, a path marked by resilience, ethical action, and the unwavering belief that even the darkest chapters of life can leave behind a legacy of light. In the end, the legacy of this story is unmistakable. It is the enduring proof that courage, intelligence, and integrity can overcome manipulation, that justice paired with forgiveness restores balance, and that a family, once fractured by cruelty, can emerge stronger, wiser, and more unified than ever before. The story lives on, not as a tale of victimhood, but as a blueprint for resilience, a guide for navigating conflict, and a testament to the transformative power of principled action. Its lessons will echo through generations, ensuring that what we endured becomes a source of guidance, strength, and inspiration for the future.